Okay. So hello and welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming to our webinar today on childcare, wellness and flexible working. I'm Kirsty, a member of the 1804 team. We usually have our founder, Holly Marriott, that introduces these webinars. As some of you who may know Holly, she's on maternity leave at the moment, waiting on the imminent arrival of her second child. And for those of you that may not know Holly or 1804, just to give you a brief summary, 1804 is a flexible on-demand talent network consisting of highly skilled individuals from a wide variety of fields who are interested in working with our growing global client base. I'm sure we've got maybe some of our members today. I'd like to introduce you to our host for today's webinar, Fran Cousins, who's an independent certified business psychologist, academic tutor, and author of Work Psychology: The Basics. She's also the founder of She's a Boss Book Club podcast. We're very excited to have her here today. So I will now hand over to you, Fran, to introduce the webinar and our speakers today. Thank you, Fran.
Thanks so much, Kirsty. So welcome everyone to the webinar, whether you're on live or watching back. I'm really looking forward to getting into discussing all things workplace flexibility as it relates to childcare, well-being, all of those sorts of things. We've got our experts in the room. So before we get into that fascinating topic, let's start with some more introductions. So Gemma, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself, and then we'll pass over to Johnny.
Thank you, Fran. Hi, everyone. I am Gemma Taylor. I've got 12 years HR experience across a number of different industries. At the moment, I'm working for Cadent Gas. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Cadent, we're responsible for responding to gas leaks across the whole of the country, and also the maintenance of a large portion of the country's gas infrastructure as well. So a little bit more about me. So 6 years ago, I became a mum for the first time, and my son was born at 32 weeks. So he was really early. He was only £3 when he was born. And that's kind of, I guess, the starting point of my passion when it comes to kind of talking about all things working flexibly. The impact that it had on us as a family spending time in the neonatal intensive care unit was absolutely massive, especially on his father, who was expected to return back to work at quite an early age. So that was really, really difficult. And I'm sure we'll go into that a bit more later. And then more recently, I've had my 1-year-old daughter, Amelie. So at the moment, yeah, I'm a full-time working mum with a child in childcare. The nursery bills, as you can imagine, are absolutely eye-watering, and she's only in there 2.5 days a week. So yeah, it's a tricky time for us at the moment. But yeah, no, I'm looking forward to delving into the topics in more detail today.
Thanks so much, Gemma. Thank you for sharing that as well about your first child. I actually also had a very premature first baby. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about that and the challenges associated with how work fits back into life after and during those times. But I'll let Johnny introduce himself before we get overexcited on that.
Thank you very much. And it's lovely to meet everyone. My name is Johnny. I work at Adidas. I don't have the credentials that Gemma and Fran do. I'm a business analyst by trade, but like a lived experience, like Gemma said, we went through our we've only just had our first child very recently. He's only 12 weeks old. He's actually just been to have his 12-week injections this morning. So our journey started just over 4 years ago, and we've done it through IVF. So again, where it was spending the time in the neonatal ward for Gemma, the whole journey through IVF and navigating that trip was kind of what got me into working on the family-friendly policies at Adidas. And Adidas is a huge company. The UK Adidas is the part that I work for, and the way that we've done this, that I'm sure we'll touch on more, is by creating a gender equity network of colleagues. It's got people from HR, from business analysts, sales, etc. And we all get together and we put the proposals together that are then submitted to our senior leadership team. And with a lot of research and case studies, it's kind of then left to them to decide on what gets approved and what doesn't get approved. But yeah, it was my journey through IVF that really got me intrigued in this, and the equity within, as we were saying, paternity leave and fertility leave and everything like that. So again, really excited to learn more and talk about my experience.
Thanks, Johnny, for sharing, and such huge congratulations as well for
Thank you very
becoming a
much.
parent. I bet that feels like an amazing milestone, and you will sleep again. I promise. It feels like you won't, but you will. One day you'll wake up and realize you've had more than 20 minutes sleep in a go, and you'll feel like a new man. So I think actually that leads us really nicely onto our first kind of topic. So Johnny, if I start with, maybe you could share your thoughts a bit first, but Gemma, I know you'll have lots to say on this subject as well, which is in terms of how HR leaders can really facilitate making space for parents to do what they need to do, whether that be going through IVF, any number of pre and postnatal appointments. I, for example, had preeclampsia with my first child, and then I was a high risk pregnancy, as you can imagine. Gemma, I'm sure you were the same the second time around, which meant lots and lots and lots of time off work, lots of appointments, lots of emergency trips to hospitals. So how can HR facilitate that, do you think, for parents in a way that is both, you know, allowing that flexibility, but also recognizing the needs of the business and making sure that things continue to run as they need to?
It's a really tough one. Obviously, being a big business like we are, it's there's a lot of people, and there's a lot of people who kind of have the special needs of kind of having time off, and managing it isn't always the best. We have certain managers who are very kind of easygoing, who have as much time off as you need, and some more by the book. So I think for us, it was having a policy in place that would let people kind of know what they had access to and what was available, which came from us putting together a team that kind of wasn't solely based around HR, and people who were kind of made up merit a lot of different kind of life experiences with what they'd gone through. So I think having our gender equity network really let us put together a really kind of practical policy that so many people had looked over it, and so many people had, say, preeclampsia, they'd had C-sections, they'd gone through IVF. We'd had all these kind of different examples of kind of things that needed time off. It just made our policy that we kind of put in place, made it really kind of, it was just an all-round kind of good one for everyone. Whereas if you've not had the lived experience, or you kind of don't ask the questions to, you know, what the people need the time off for, it's really difficult to get a practical policy in place. And we looked at a lot of different case studies, and some of the ones that we looked at coming from the co-op, where they kind of had unrestricted time off. And that eventually is our goal, where you kind of don't need to kind of let people know the amount of time off you need. You can't, it's different for everyone. You can't really do a one glove fits all policy. So that's where we hope to get to, but they're starting off small and getting bigger.
And there's a lot in there, I think, isn't there, around that trust? There has to be such a foundation of trust between the manager and the individual, but also at a much broader level across the organisation, for there to be, you know, the concept of unlimited time off could be, you know, I can think personally of many people I've interacted with where they would bulk at that and think, you know, how can we trust people to do the work? How will we know it's got done? But ultimately, I can see that that's a really admirable goal. And I think what really stood out to me as well when you were speaking, Johnny, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, Gemma, is when we talk about, you know, equality in the workplace, particularly around parental leave, very often that conversation is geared towards women, rightly, because that's, you know, we need to think about that. How do we reintegrate women into the workplace after they've been on maternity leave? You know, how can we be flexible in those ways? But also, what about the men and the fathers, as it pertains to, in your experience, Johnny, IVF, and Gemma, obviously you referenced, and I had a very similar situation whereby your husband only had a couple of weeks paternity leave. So Gemma, perhaps you can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, the example with my husband's paternity leave is something is still a sore point for me now. It must have been so difficult for him because everybody, I think, unless you've been in that situation, everybody thinks of paternity leave as being that 2 weeks of when you're helping your baby settle in and come home and do all of the great stuff. But the reality for my husband was that his paternity leave was staring at his baby in an incubator. So not only did he not get that settling in home space, that he should have been entitled to, which is such an important part, especially supporting mum and baby when they first come back, and also for his own mental health. But not only that, he also kind of wasn't there when my son was still critically ill. He was expected to be back at work and trying to juggle meetings. Now, luckily, he had a very supportive manager that said, "Oh, take the time, it's fine, you can work flexibly." But actually, I think sometimes we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and without that kind of robust actual policy that says, "No, do you know what? Here, take this time, take this space." I think sometimes even if your manager is saying, "Oh, you can come and go from work," you feel almost torn between the two. And I think he held a lot of guilt. So if he was up at the neonatal unit, he would be thinking, "Oh, I really need to log back into work." And there was just that blurred line. So I think that the having a robust policy in place is really important. Now, I think it's a topic of conversation that we thought would come up, the neonatal one specifically, as there is the new bill that is being released, which unfortunately is not going to come into play until next year. But it is a case of, is that going to go far enough to really give parents that are going through that journey the support they need? And it's a real shame that we've still got to wait this amount of time for it to come into play as well, because it is the trauma that it leaves on families is really real.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that came to mind for me, Gemma, when you were talking about that, was that for many organisations, the situation is that paternity leave is partially paid, and then the second week, if maybe entirely unpaid, which was the case for my husband. And that always makes me think about, is there a socioeconomic consideration here as well? Because that assumes the privilege of a family to be able to take potentially a quarter of that income that month away. So while 2 weeks feels like absolutely nothing, particularly in the circumstances that you lived through, Gemma, for some families, the reality will be that that 2 weeks isn't even really available. So I think to broaden the conversation out, because I know lots of people watching will be parents, but some, won't. And there's many more elements to working flexibly in addition to parenting, although my goodness, we know that's a big one. What else do we think about when we think about working flexibly? Is there a privilege to being able to work flexibly and take that time off? And I think for me, when I first thought about this topic, what came to mind was that many roles, such as, when we think about working flexibly, we think about working from home. We think about, leaving off the office a bit earlier that day and catching up later on, or whatever it might look like. But for lots of roles, that's not an option. If you work in construction, if you work in hospitality, if you provide cleaning services, which may not be the most highly paid roles in comparison to others, that's not something you can do from home. You can't just nip out early or be flexible on your hours. So, I wondered if you had any thoughts around that, Johnny, in terms of how we can possibly start that conversation to be more equitable around what flexible working looks like for everybody, not just those in roles where you can nip out of the office.
It's a really tough one, isn't it? And I'm again very lucky. I'm an office worker. I've just this is actually my last Friday at work. I've started to go on compressed hours, so 5 days down to 4, which I know not everyone can do. I guess what I kind of see that's working well here is when you go more around the continent and around to Europe, and luckily enough recently to be in Antwerp, and a lot of like the bars and restaurants there, like they are not open kind of some Saturday night, some Sunday night. And I was so confused by this, and I was like, surely this is like prime time for people like, wanting to go out for food and drinks, and it is work-life balance. They're open more on the weekdays, and I guess that's something that kind of goes fully against the norm that we expect over here in the UK, but it would have to be kind of something that went on over time that became more and more normal to us. But at the moment that just seems alien, like going down into town and half the restaurants being closed. But it's something that if that industry would kind of want to see that sort of flexibility, would have to be something that the general public would, you know, be happy with, which I'm sure over time it would become a normality. But at the start, I could imagine it being quite difficult for people to just fathom that this is a change that is required.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's not to bring up the C word, but I think post-COVID there has been a real shift in office-based roles, not all of them, but a large proportion where, working from home is really standard, it's really usual, and there is some assumed or implied flexibility within that in a case where that wouldn't have been the case before. I was actually self-employed at the time of COVID, but prior to that, I worked as a consultant, so I was head of assessment consulting, and I was everywhere. Gemma, a little bit like you are sometimes, I think, by the sounds of things, all over the country. I'd be in Dublin one day, I'd be in London the next, and then Southampton, and then back home in Leicester, and then somewhere else. And at the time, that was just what we did. That was the job. But now consultants hardly ever leave their house, to be honest. If you go to a client site, that's a rare thing. So at the prior to COVID, it was unthinkable that would be what a consultant role was. You consulted, you went around the world where the clients were, but now we don't. So although I think we all hope it doesn't take a COVID like event to change perceptions in how we work again, it does go to show that it is possible and it can be done. That's happened in some industries, but there's a way to go in others. Gemma, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, definitely. I do think that COVID was a turning point, because pre-COVID, I think that when you looked at flexible working, a lot of people with perhaps a more kind of like traditional mentality would if somebody had said, "Oh, can I work from home 3 days a week?" It would be almost met with kind of, "Why would you do that? The rest of us are here in the office. That's not fair." And so there was this huge cultural shift post-COVID, which was great. But then when we look at all the industries that didn't impact, so take the industry I'm working in now, Cadent Gas, the majority of my workforce are blue collar, so there's an assumption that they're all on these shift patterns and they're all kind of slotted into the system, and therefore they're on shift or on rota at specific times. So one of them puts in a flexible working request of some nature or requires some flexibility for one reason or another, whether that be child related or not. It's closed down pretty quickly. Whereas that's where I think we're quite privileged as HR leaders to be able to then challenge managers to say, and this is what we should be doing, saying, why? Have you thought about this? If we take them out that shift pattern, can we maybe look at it a different way? Can we look at different technology to build the shifts differently? And for me, it's just about the more people that we can get on board this mentality that if we truly want to embrace diversity and inclusion in the workplace, this needs to go into a number of other different industries. So just keep asking why. And that doesn't just have to be HR people like me. People like Johnny in all realms of the business can say, "Oh, that bar person needs to be full-time, or that restaurant needs to be open all these days." Just always, why does it need to be? Can they do a job share? Could we potentially change the working hours? So, and selling them what's the benefit: increased engagement, increased diversity, increased inclusion. There are, as the difficulties that they might think exist in their head, they're probably not thinking of the benefits that they'll get on the back of it tenfold.
It's that because it's the way we've always done it kind of mentality,
Definitely.
isn't it? But I think that is such a good tip, Gemma, for HR leaders and everyone really who has an interest in this, is to say, but why? And I think, as we know, there are organisations that are doing this really well. So being able to pull, as you said earlier, Johnny, case study examples and actually show the data and say, do you know what? The data suggests that this does work really well. It's a really good thing for our people in terms of engagement. And we know that drives performance. So although it might feel alien, just because it's different doesn't mean it's wrong. But one thing I think also, just to play devil's advocate, I suppose, for a moment, is that when we talk about flexible working and working from home, I think we always think about that as a really positive thing. It can only be a good thing, really, to be able to be flexible. But is there any examples where actually there could be drawbacks of working flexibly as it relates to childcare or anything else really. And particularly I would probably like to focus around well-being. I don't know, Johnny, if you've got any thoughts on that you'd like to share.
Obviously, working from home has some massive perks, but I do find that working from home, my days are drawn out a lot longer. So kind of if we take out like kind of the getting to and from work, I'll start probably the same time that I would normally leave to get to work. With kind of my partner and Noah being downstairs, I do feel myself more kind of pulled downstairs to help where I can. It's 3 days a week in the office. So those 3 days, have a slight sense of guilt that I'm not present. So then when I am at home for the 2 days, I do feel, I gravitate downstairs to like have that time. I very much like kind of want to, if Lauren needs to do anything, I'll, take him as soon as I can to do it. And it means that my work day then kind of starts to creep longer and longer into the evening. Whereas if I'm in the office, I get in early to miss the traffic and I can leave at 4 o'clock if I crack on with my work, which I normally do. So it's a bit of a blessing and a curse, and again, things like lunch tend to kind of go a bit more out the window. I would rather, spend time, help out where I can so that, my partner and Noah have an easier afternoon. So it's those like kind of they're not really sacrifices because I would do them every single day and I wouldn't think twice about it, but it really does kind of prolong the day. And then we get to the point a little bit later where it's, oh, if you were meant to have finished at 4, but I can't because I've done this, this, and this, and this. And I feel awful then trying to explain, oh, well, because I've tried to help you, I've actually now not helped you because now I'm in work for an extra 2 hours. So it's a difficult one that, again, I'm only 12 weeks into fatherhood, so I'm still kind of learning how to balance it out. But I imagine this is quite a big struggle for a lot of people wanting to be there, but then also wanting to finish on time.
Yeah. And I think we talk a lot sort of colloquially around this idea of, work interfering with home life and work-life balance. But actually, what you described really nicely there, Johnny, is actually home can really interfere with work as well. And I think sometimes that almost feels like a bit of a taboo to say, like you shouldn't admit that actually your home life is getting in the way of work because home should be everything. I think in
Exactly.
2024, there's space to recognise that, is there such a thing as work and life? Is your life actually a separate thing to work, or are they one homogenous, is it all part of your life? But it's when, those boundary blurs can be really beneficial, like you've described, but also, as you say, I definitely work much longer hours when I'm left to my own devices. I have to really actually schedule in a reminder to go and eat, like you say, to go and have lunch, because there's no one else around me popping out to go and get lunch. There's no cues around that. There's just me here. And there is some really interesting evidence actually emerging that suggests that working from home can actually create greater stress and create a larger demand on women in particular, the data suggests. But it's that kind of, oh, you can just pop a wash load on, you can just do this. And I certainly feel that. Gemma, you're nodding, so I suspect you feel this too. Because I'm at home, I almost feel as though I should be doing a full day of work and doing all the little bits and pieces around the house, so that when everybody else comes home, there's this kind of spotless house as though a maid's been, and I've done a full day's work, which is not a reality or an expectation. And let's be clear, the expectation is me. It's coming from me. It's not someone else. That you would do that because you're not physically there. Gemma, I don't know if you experienced that or.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think it is. I always sit there, and unfortunately my desk at home is in the same room where I hang the washing, so it's always there just staring at me like this should be put away, and how could I be using my lunch hour more productively, when actually there's nothing wrong with just sitting and taking lunch. Or I always think, oh, I'm going to take the dog on a walk at lunchtime, but I never do. I either continue on my emails and calls or go and run errands that need to be done around the house, because with 2 kids it's always a million things to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think another point on that sort of home to work interference, which I suspect is something that we all share on this call, and everybody watching, if you've got young children, trying to have a phone call with 2 toddlers in the house is like trying to, conduct a meeting in World War III, even if they're not in the same room as you. So there is a juggle. And again, I think almost coming back to that sort of equality piece around, is working from home a privilege only for the richer people or people in more highly paid jobs? It also assumes you've got a separate space that you can be in where you're not right in the thick of it, that you've got a large enough house to have a separate space. My space is also not separate to the washing, hence the blurred background, as I've just been away for a week. So I totally understand. Yeah. But I think what can businesses do or organizations do around some of that? I think there's an ongoing question, isn't it, as to whose responsibility is well-being in the workplace? Is it the employee? Is it the organisation? Probably it's a bit of both, but where does it fall? But is there anything, Gemma, that organisations can do or HR leaders can encourage in their employees to maybe set better boundaries or cope with some of that clash a bit?
Definitely. I think so my manager is really leading by example here. So in my first couple of weeks working for Caden back in February, she had already organised a team day, and it was all about taking time to pause. And some of it was a little bit more on the extreme end, in that there was a sound bath as part of this, which definitely wasn't for everyone, but it was a really great session in terms of talking about how we're kind of always living in this fight or flight response state, and where we're on to the next task. Are we ever taking time to just like sit back, pause, be mindful, bring our kind of adrenaline down a bit, and not needing to always be on? What's our own boundaries for constantly answering calls, even if they're not scheduled in our calendar and we don't have the time to take them? And it was just that she put this session in with this professional that really just made you sit and think about how actually there's only one person that's going to be able to make that better, and that's me, and setting my own boundaries. So I've kind of always gone into this job thinking of this. Doesn't always work. So I do think that you need to continue that narrative. And I think all leaders could make sure that they keep on having like psychological safety moments in their calls, and sending out reminders, and even just scheduling like half an hour out with their team and getting their team on a call and then saying, I want you all to now go on a walk or grab a snack or go and do something. I just think it's about the doing, because yeah, it was just, even though I do still get kind of caught up in the day to day and I don't follow it all the time, it was really powerful message that made me think of some boundaries that I have set. So just like a little one that I thought was quite interesting was, now if somebody calls me and they say, oh, have you got 5 minutes, because I'm working in HR, I get that about 100 times a day. Sometimes I'll say yes, but I have only got until, and then give a specific time so that I can then drop off that call before and get a drink before my next meeting. So, and that came from my leadership kind of instilling that knowledge onto us, forcing us to take the time to consider those things. And then what is needed now is that follow up, just to make sure that we do kind of think about that, I think.
Yeah, and I think in many ways, as you're talking there, although it sounds like your manager is really leading the charge with this, I think as we move more towards flexible practices, the onus around setting those boundaries is increasingly on the employee, rather than, there's always obviously been an element of that, but there's no manager saying, oh, why are you still in the office? Go on, go home, or whatever it might be. That's just not happening. And because we can answer emails on our phone, we don't have to be at the laptop. If you're firing off a quick email, the assumption might be that you're just doing it while dinner's cooking, even if you're still at your desk, Johnny, 3 hours after perhaps you said you were going to leave. And I'm really glad you mentioned psychological safety there as well, Gemma, because I thought it was something that it would be good to talk about. So just to kind of put my psychologist hat on, I suppose, for a minute and define that, really, when we talk about psychological safety in the workplace, it's the idea of being able to speak honestly, to ask questions, to raise concerns or ideas without the fear of being judged or reprimanded for doing it. And obviously that feels really relevant as we talk about flexible working and how people can actually honestly say what they need. Johnny, how do you think that organisations can foster more of a sense of psychological safety as it relates to flexible working practices, needs of parents, all of those sorts of things?
I think it's good to have the parameters kind of out there to bear for everyone to see. I've worked in businesses previously where we've had flexible working, which is fantastic. But then when people are scheduling meetings 4 till 5 and you came in and did a 7 till 3, and you're a bit like, oh God, like, do I stay or like, do I miss
Mm.
it? Like, the fear of like missing out as well. Like, for someone in my position, I'm still quite young in my role and wanting to progress. So missing out feels like something that I absolutely cannot afford to do. And if it affects me down the line. So the company that I was speaking about that I did work for, they had core meeting hours. So you couldn't put a meeting outside of 10 a.m. till 3 p.m. and 12 till 1 was kind of out of the mix as well for lunch. So that just made it really kind of clear. These are your core meeting times. And again, there was maybe one or two like, have you got a quick 5 minutes, which is more of like a personal maybe chat or like just a one-to-one that would come through. But overall, the kind of messages, this is core meeting time, stuck really well and it resonated really, really well with everyone because it was something that everyone kind of, no one wanted 8 a.m. meetings, no one wanted 4 p.m. meetings going on. So that was just a small change that really, really worked.
And I'm thinking, as you're speaking, Johnny, I think that's such a great idea and it makes perfect sense on paper. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about my husband who frequently has meetings scheduled in at 7:30 in the morning. He is expected to be in the office at all times, and frequently he also has meetings scheduled in 5 till 5:30. So for an organisation where that is currently the cultural norm, what steps either Gemma or Johnny, do you think that an organisation who's at that end of the scale can start to take on a very practical level to move towards flexible working and inclusive practices being more the norm?
It's again, it's a difficult one because I have been in roles as well where I've kind of had accounts in Australia, so being in for very, very early in the morning so I could speak to accounts and hold calls was something that was required. And then into that role a little bit, I then kind of started looking after parts of North America as well. So that completely by the geographical timelines, like absolutely threw my day into like complete chaos. So it was something that I kind of never managed to control. It was either come in very early one week and then the next week do later to speak to American accounts. But yeah, again, I felt that the onus was on me for that one. There was nothing that kind of came from anyone else. It was just how I managed my time. And I managed my time by kind of, trying to work my hours around what I found would get the most performance out of my day. But I did find that when I did that, I did my hours. I would never go over because I'd kind of gone so, well, for me, above and beyond, like coming in
Mm.
really, really early to then leave like perfectly on time.
Yeah. And I think as you're speaking there, I think, well done for setting those boundaries, despite the working hours being a bit off. But as you're speaking, I'm sure Gemma's thinking the same. For me, my daughter's nursery opens at 7:45 and it shuts at 5:45. So I've not got the option to be at work at 7:30. Either 7:30 in the day. And so, that presents a challenge then, doesn't it? Because the onus is on someone to collect that child, and if you've not got family or other people nearby who can do it, then it becomes really challenging. But I guess taking a step back, because Gemma, I'm mindful, I wanted to ask your opinion on, from an HR perspective, what do we do, or how can we encourage organisations who are currently not at all in the world of flexible working or core meeting hours to take any steps towards this? What would be some sort of initial steps you would recommend in your experience?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think a lot of organizations are on the right path. When I first started in HR, I can remember whenever a flexible working application would come in, the managers would immediately want to go through with me the 7 reasons why to decline a flexible working request so that they could pick which one they were going to use this time. To fast forward now, where managers do seem to understand that there is a lot of benefit in allowing flexibility to the employees. And I think it is just a case of giving employees the confidence to challenge their managers, but understanding that by asking the question or saying to them, look, this is how this is impacting me in my personal circumstances. I don't feel like I'm striking the right work-life balance, or whatever it might look like, whatever that story is. It doesn't have to be confrontational. And I think most managers, most leaders, they've got to that position for a reason. I think sometimes they just kind of need somebody to just be honest, because some of these leaders might be people that don't have necessarily the personal life demands that some employees do. And when they actually then learn more about it and how it's making them feel, they might respond completely empathetically. But I think sometimes people will be afraid to kind of challenge the norm, like the 7 till 5 meetings, because they think either one, it's going to be seen as them upsetting the apple cart, or two, being disruptive or confrontational, or it might stifle their development. Whereas actual fact, in reality, that's not always the case. A lot of people will appreciate the honesty. So I think that is a good starting point. It's not going to work in all instances. There are unfortunately some dinosaurs out there that it unfortunately is going to be the case that it might not work like that, but then maybe that's not the right cultural match for between that organization and the employee. It would be an ideal world if we could coach all managers around to the proactive way of thinking. But I think if you can sit confident that you've advocated for yourself well enough, then at least you've tried all you can. And as HR professionals, we can help instill that confidence in people. I always lean on my own examples. So when I was going off on maternity leave, for example, it was right on the cusp of like my career really getting to a position where I was really excited about it. I was never meant to be a flexible working from home mum or part-time worker. I love going to work, and then I love kind of switching off with my children at the weekends or evenings. But it very much is a case of I've always wanted my career to be a key point of focus for me. And I got in my own head about going on maternity leave the second time at this pivotal stage of my career, rather than kind of almost putting myself in a box and almost signing myself off. And I think I could have easily fallen into that, but luckily I had super supportive managers who allowed me to kind of blossom, which then gave me the confidence to say, when I went on maternity leave, if there's any vacancies, please make sure that you send them to me while I'm off. Please keep me informed. Couple of months before coming back, already having a conversation about what my job was going to look like, because actually I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm not I if I don't see myself as any different to pre-maternity, then why should they? But I think too many people get it in their own heads that they're affecting themselves, and therefore that can then like come across in the conversations that they're having. They're almost counting themselves out.
Yeah, and I know that we have focused on women quite a lot in the parental discussion, but the fact of the matter is that in most cases it is the woman that needs to take some maternity leave, not always, but usually 6 weeks is an absolute minimum, and however you cut it, that is a chunk of time, and many people taking up to and over a year. I, as a self-employed person, took 9 months, which is a long time to not be at work when you're self-employed. And there were still people that felt that 9 months was too young for my daughter to go into nursery. So, you can never win, can you? But I think one of the things that I was thinking of as you were speaking there, Gemma, as well, is that, the data really supports having women in your company and having them in leadership positions. Diversity on executive leadership teams could show up to a 10-fold increase in revenue, as opposed to an all white male executive leadership team. And that is nothing against white males, but it is very pro diversity, especially as it pertains to women. There's some really good evidence published in that over the last couple of years. So I think if we do have dinosaurs, to use your term, Gemma, which I think is probably spot on, where there's still that resistance to flexibility. If appealing to sort of the human side doesn't work, then I think there's a lot of really strong data available, an easy Google search in terms of the pros from a business organizational bottom line perspective when it comes to allowing flexibility and making sure that you're making space for a diversity of people to stay and progress within the company. Well, that brings me to the end of the questions, the sort of formal questions that we had listed for today. But I want to make sure that we've covered everything, that was important to talk about. So, Johnny, I don't know if you had any final thoughts or areas we've not covered that were on your list of important things to discuss.
Well, this has been a completely new experience for me. It's the first time I've ever done this, so I've really enjoyed kind of listening and learning from yourself and Gemma. It's been fantastic. Uh, I guess from my side, like one of the things that I kind of really championed, and maybe the reason that I am here was our kind of move to extend our family-friendly policies. So we were part of the group at Adidas who had maternity from statutory increased to 26 weeks full pay from the and it went from being 2 years in service to only being 26 weeks in service. And paternity, we had improved from 2% at 90%, and that went up to 6 weeks full pay. So the whole kind of parental leave has been something that like I've been really interested in, and kind of then the kind of broader parental policies. So, and just about that. So, I mean, I've really, really enjoyed like looking into it, researching it, and I guess just that learning for me has been fantastic, but always kind of interested to see what other companies are doing and like what other people think, would be more of a benefit, because a lot of this is just it's additional time off or it's kind of the pay being increased. But again, there's not really any of like the flexibility side that we've spoken about today. So yeah, learning about that and getting a better understanding of that would be fantastic if you guys had any experience in that from a policy point of view.
I'll hand over to Gemma to speak about policy, but just briefly before I do, I think it's been really beneficial, Johnny, to hear firstly the great work that Adidas is doing in this area. So, that sounds like, you guys are really championing that, but also I think to share a real life lived example of somebody who, you are a parent working from home. You've articulated really clearly that actually, if anything, you're working longer and harder now than you were previously. Yes, you're taking those little breaks during the day, but you are online and available and working hard, and it's certainly not of detriment to your career or the output. So I think that's been really nice to hear. We know these things to be true in principle, but having a real human talk about it, I think is really nice. But Gemma, sorry, over to you to answer Johnny's question more fully.
So was it the policy on flexible working that you wanted to
Yeah.
understand more about? Yeah, absolutely. So everywhere that I've worked in the last since post COVID, it's been really important for us to have these kind of flexible working policies in place to support what that looks like. To use a really extreme example, there's been a couple of occasions where I've noticed there's been a kind of a huge decrease in an employee's performance. And when we've looked into why that might be, it might be because they're actually trying to balance childcare with work and not necessarily allowing that child to booking that child into nursery. And we've had to kind of revert back to policy to make sure that actually they're kind of following the principles of this and still able to be present and perform right. But it's just something that's just been playing on my mind throughout the whole of this conversation, really, because as we are in this cost of living crisis, can that person even afford to get that person into that child into childcare during the cost of living crisis? It might not be. So everybody just needs to be, whilst we do have these policies that are there to support, I do think that we also need to be really mindful that this is a new field that we're operating in. We're in a new kind of economic time of difficulty. Everything's changing for everybody on a day-to-day basis. And we've now got new Labour government coming in that's probably going to introduce even more changes. So we just need to stay really vigilant to how that could be affecting everybody from all walks of life in all different ways, because I don't think you could even get that into one policy because it's just so broad and so diverse. So yeah, I think it's important that we just stay vigilant, really, and really open-minded. Everybody just needs to not make assumptions about people's personal circumstances and why they're struggling or not struggling, and just to kind of be a bit more kind to one another, I'd say.
Thanks, Gemma. And I think really if anything, that's kind of summarised the key theme, I suppose, of this whole conversation, which is that it's so nuanced, and you cannot provide one blanket policy that will work for everybody. And although on paper that might seem like the right approach because therefore you're treating everyone fairly, the reality is that sometimes we have to treat people differently in order to give them an equal opportunity to perform well at work and be healthy and bring their whole selves to work. And so I think the key message really is to just keep having that conversation, isn't it, with people as humans, and recognise that just because this is how it worked for Sally in accounts doesn't mean that that's how it's going to work for sort of Khalid, in IT. So it's continuing those conversations and making sure that it's never a one and done approach, even in organisations that are already taking such big strides in this area or have made big movements, to remain vigilant, like you say, Gemma, and not think that sort of job done, because like you say, I think even more changes are coming, and none of us know what that's going to look like yet. Well, thank you so much for all of your input, Johnny and Gemma. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've definitely learned a lot, and it's been interesting to hear. Thank you so much to everyone who's been on live, and I hope that those of you watching back have enjoyed it as well. And thank you to 1804 for facilitating this. Kirsty, I'll just hand back over to you to let you finish off the call, and I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
So
Fran.
a massive thank you to you, Fran, Gemma, and Johnny. It's been a really great conversation, hearing about your experiences and ideas and thoughts around the topic. So we really, really appreciate that. And thank you to all of those joining us and those of you that may be watching this back at a later date. A massive thank you from us. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Take care.